Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. They told us the infection started with a series of experimental antiviral trials gone wrong. Labs in Bethesda, in Berlin, in Shenzhen, simultaneously sabotaged or silenced. But that was 5, maybe 10 years ago. I don't think the dates matter anymore. What matters is that I'm still alive. My name is Mara Klein, once a paramedic for DC Fire and EMS. Back then, I drove a white Dodge Charger with a cracked dashboard and stocked it with caffeine tablets, trauma shears, and whatever band-aids the city still budgeted. Now I sleep beside a half-rotted shopping cart in a freight container, and everything I carry fits into a stolen hiker's pack duct-taped at the straps. I survived the breach in Baltimore. I saw the Red Line collapse, car by car, in the tunnels under Union Station. I walked through the fire corridors of the burned district after the oil trains exploded outside Harrisburg. So when I say this, when I tell you the Colosseum was the worst thing I ever saw, I need you to believe me. It started with a radio call, not the old ES frequencies. We stopped trusting those years ago. This was low range, piggybacking off a decommissioned weather station west of Denver. The voice crackled at dusk, just as the wind carried sand off the collapsed wind farms. To all clean and able, to all blood verified and unbitten, the Iron Lords offer 4 nights of shelter, food and standing pay. Win the trials, and you walk free. Coordinates to follow. Signal ends. A baited hook. A deliberate tone. Male, calm, scripted. I was traveling with 4 others at the time. Ray, ex-Navy, sharp-eyed, haunted. Anna, former pastry chef, deadly with a tire iron. Nolan, a teen who hadn't spoken since Missouri. And Calvin, once a high school biology teacher, still wearing a Letterman jacket from 2003. We'd been running low on water, picking clean bones near I-70, when the call came through on a salvaged old portable radio. We looked at each other, none of us willing to speak first. 3 hours later, we were walking toward the signal. The arena was real. We saw the floodlights 2 days out, pulsing against the low clouds like heat lightning. On the 3rd morning, we crested a ridge and found the stadium, a wrecked minor league football field called Redline Arena, once home to the Denver Wranglers. Now, it had been rebuilt with stacked shipping containers, steel gates, and sniper towers. A constant hum of generators filled the air. Behind the noise, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of chanting. Ray muttered, "We walk in there, we're cattle." But we kept walking. The guards were masked, clad in mismatched military surplus, their vests marked with the Iron Lord's symbol. A blood-red gear wheel split down the center. They searched us, scanned us with an old field-issue IR thermometer, and checked our necks, arms, and ankles for scars or bite marks. We were led through a tunnel that once held concessions, the walls stained with faded ads for beer and local car dealerships. Inside, they offered food, real food. Not tins or moldy hardtack, but roasted vegetables, spiced beans, and cornbread baked over a steel drum fire. The smell made my eyes sting. It had been 6 days since my last warm meal. We weren't alone. Dozens of others had arrived. Drifters, scavengers, warbands, even a few well-fed mercs from the Texoma wastes. No one talked much. We were all calculating odds. They told us the trials would begin at dusk. 1 contender per team per night. If your team lasted the 4, you walked free with supply crates, fuel, and land claim passes signed by the Iron Lords themselves. If your team failed, well, most of us had seen what happened to failures. We'd watched the infected tear through convoys and safe zones alike. We knew. They didn't call them zombies, not anymore. Too many movies had ruined that word. People called them different things depending on region or trauma. In the north, they were blackmouths. Out west, creepers. In the Gulf, the Hollow. But in the stadium, the announcer used a more theatrical name. "Welcome, challengers. Tonight, you face the Grinners." I didn't ask why. but the name stuck. We drew numbers. Ours was Team 13, fitting. Ray went first. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. Just strapped a salvaged chest plate over his hoodie, took the blade they handed him, a rebar club with barbed wire spiraled tight, and walked down the tunnel toward the floodlit pit. The stands weren't full, but the noise was deafening. Makeshift horns, stomping feet, cheers that sounded more like howls. The Colosseum wasn't dry. Waist-deep floodwater filled the lower third of the arena. They claimed it made the fights more fair, slowed the grinners down. We watched through a high-mounted screen. Cameras rigged to old GoPro housings streamed the chaos. Ray moved fast, smart. He didn't waste swings, but there were 4 grinners that night, each missing some piece of what made them human. One crawled on broken arms, another wore a mailman's cap rotted into its scalp. Ray finished 3. The last got his leg. By the time the retrieval crew pulled him out, his thigh was shredded. They carried him past us on a stretcher of old stop signs and shouted something about 24-hour monitoring. We never saw him again. That night I didn't sleep. I listened to the chants outside, the hum of the electric fences, the sharp metallic clicks of someone loading a rifle too close to the barracks. We were packed into what used to be a team locker room, 14 beds for 50 bodies. The benches were long gone, the floors slick with mildew, and the air reeked of sweat, old leather and bleach. Someone coughed for nearly an hour, a wet sound that drew glares but no sympathy. No one here wanted to catch anything, not even a cold. Anna sat on her bunk, fingers wrapped around the handle of her tire iron like it was a prayer bead. She hadn't taken off her coat since we arrived. The wool at her collar was stiff with grime. Her brown hair was tied back with a leather cord, and her boots still held flecks of dry blood from a skirmish near Junction. I tried to say something, but she cut me off before I even opened my mouth. "I'm going," she said. I blinked. "You don't have to. We can find another way." "There is no other way." She stood, quiet but sure, and walked out before I could respond. They didn't do introductions for night 2. No names. Just the number. Team 13, step forward. The floodlights came on like the sun had been yanked up by a chain. The stands roared back to life. Some of the crowd had torches, others glow sticks strapped to their shoulders. A few wore helmets, motorcycle, riot control, even sports mascots, painted with tally marks. They chanted something rhythmic and crude, stomping their boots in unison. Anna descended into the pit. This time the arena was worse. They'd released oil into the water, motor oil or transmission fluid, I couldn't tell. It floated in rainbows across the surface, slick and reflective, hiding the movement underneath. I could see her hesitation as she stepped into the shallows, scanning the opaque black sheen for shapes beneath. Then the gates opened. 5 grinners. These weren't the emaciated shamblers we'd seen on the roads. These were bigger, fresh, or maybe fed. One still had most of a hunting jacket. Another dragged a steel rebar pipe tangled in its ribcage like a bone anchor. Their jaws were slack, their eyes glassy, but they moved fast. Too fast. Anna didn't freeze. She did what she always did, kept her body low, movements efficient. She cracked the first grinner's knee backward with a sweeping strike and pushed it under with her boot, using the water as a weapon. The second got close, too close, but she wedged her tire iron under its jaw and drove it back, using leverage, not force. The crowd didn't cheer, they screamed, but this wasn't a celebration. They wanted her to fail. The third one grabbed her wrist. The fourth lunged at her back. She twisted hard, shoulder rolling with practiced muscle memory, and wrenched free, only to slip on the oil. Her elbow smacked the concrete barrier. For a second she was half submerged, kicking, weapon gone. That second almost killed her. The fifth grinner came in fast. I could see its silhouette through the high-feed camera. A narrow body, likely female before the virus. Long hair clinging to its rotting face. It lunged down, nails extended like claws. Anna didn't scream. She caught the beast's chin with her forearm, drew the emergency blade from her boot, and buried it in the grinner's throat, up and through. The corpse spasmed once, then went still. By the time the guards pulled her out, she was limping. Her fingers were bleeding, but she was breathing. They wrapped her hand in gauze, gave her a metal coin marked Trial 2 survived, and shoved her back into the barracks without a word. She sat on her bunk and didn't speak for 3 hours. I didn't ask. Nolan watched her from his cot. He still hadn't said a word since Kansas City, not even when we were ambushed by a broken convoy near Goodland. He was maybe 16, thin as wire, with a buzz cut and the kind of hollow stare I'd only seen in burned-out EMTs and old ICU nurses. That night, he didn't sleep either. I remember looking at the wall, at the ancient scribbles carved into the paint long before the collapse. There were names, tallies, warnings etched in rusted nails. They lied. Don't drink the red water. Third night is when it changes. The third night. It always felt like the number that broke people. First was shock, second was trial. But the third, that was transformation. Calvin volunteered. He'd always been the voice of reason. Former biology teacher, father of 2, divorced just a year before the world cracked open. He wore the same Letterman jacket every day, even though the sleeves were split at the seams. I once asked him why he kept it. Because it still smells like a time before all this. That night, he walked into the pit without his jacket. The arena had changed again. This time the water was clear, but filled with floating debris. Plastic chairs, broken pallets, rubber tires, an obstacle course. And they'd upped the number, 6 grinners. Calvin didn't fight like the others. He wasn't a soldier or a brawler, but he was smart. He lured 2 of them into a narrow gap between crates, then collapsed the pallet stack with a swing from a loose scaffold beam. He ducked between tires, moved in short bursts, never staying still. I thought he might actually make it, but they changed the rules mid-match. Without warning, the sirens blared and the gate opened again. 2 more grinners entered, fresh, sprinting, jaws wide, eyes still wet. It wasn't part of the deal. You could see it in Calvin's face, the way his hands paused mid-grab, the calculations slipping into disbelief. He turned to run. The crowd booed, loud, angry, like betrayal. He stumbled on a plastic crate and dropped into the water. One of the grinners hit him hard, shoulder to ribs. I saw blood spread across the surface, a flash of red against grey light. He didn't come back. When they dragged him out, his arm was bent the wrong way. His eyes were open. Nolan didn't cry. Anna stood and walked out of the barracks without saying anything. The rest of us watched in silence as the guards stripped Calvin's gear, checked his neck for a bite, and then, satisfied, tossed his body onto a cart like scrap. No ceremony, no words. Just the crunch of boots on concrete and the rattle of metal wheels rolling toward whatever pit they used for the dead. And then the gate closed again, sealing us back into that lightless tomb of mildew and sweat and old fear. I don't know how long I sat there. An hour, maybe 4. Time inside that place didn't move normally. It dragged like chain links pulled through mud. I remember the room tilting gently, my stomach folding in on itself, the air feeling heavier with every breath. No one spoke to me. No one looked at me. Even the ones who weren't part of our group kept their heads down. We'd already outlasted most teams, but not without losing more than we'd brought in. Anna returned eventually. She didn't sit. She stood against the far wall with her back to the room, arms crossed, her posture like a cracked statue. Rigid but broken. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded hollow. Don't go for the kill, go for the space. I blinked at her. What? In the arena. You're not fighting them. You're buying time. That's all this is. A countdown. You last long enough, they pull you out. She glanced over her shoulder, then turned back to the wall. It's not about who you kill. It's about what the crowd wants. It hit me then. Not all at once, but slow and creeping. Like rot. They weren't measuring survival. They were measuring spectacle. I hadn't realized I was holding Calvin's jacket in my hands until I smelled the smoke and rust in the fabric. It had torn at the collar, and the patches on the elbows were nearly threadbare. I folded it and placed it on the edge of my cot. I couldn't wear it. It would have been worse than armor. It would have felt like a promise I couldn't keep. That evening, the guards came earlier. No preamble, no list, no announcement, just boots, flashlights, and a voice I didn't recognize barking from the tunnel. Trial 4, Team 13, you know who. I stood. No one said goodbye. Anna didn't move. Nolan sat perfectly still, arms around his knees, eyes on the floor. The guards didn't escort me gently. One of them shoved a rebar rod into my hands, sharpened on one end, wrapped in faded cloth. They didn't offer armor, no helmet, just a cracked face shield strapped to my wrist with a rubber band. I didn't ask why. I think they wanted me to look vulnerable. The tunnel smelled like copper and stagnant water. Each step echoed behind me, amplified by the chamber's curved walls. I passed a metal gate where previous weapons had been piled. Blunt axes, broken machetes, even a fire extinguisher stained black with old rot. At the final door, they paused me. Someone strapped a collar to my neck. It wasn't electronic, just painted red. For the crowd, the guard muttered. The gate opened. Light, noise, heat. Floodlights surged to life and poured down onto the arena, now drained almost completely. The slick concrete shone under the beam like wet stone. Pools of standing water remained in some corners, but the ground was mostly dry and stained. It looked like it had been hosed down but not cleaned. Blood pooled in the low spots. The far wall bore drag marks, long black smears carved into the cement. And the crowd, they were louder than ever. Hundreds now, maybe more. Packed into rusting bleachers, clinging to the edges of the upper decks, leaning out from repurposed observation towers above the stadium walls. They waved flags, beat on sheet metal drums, wore helmets and ski masks and bone necklaces. Someone had written "Trial Night" in engine grease across a tattered bedsheet and hung it from a steel beam. The announcer's voice thundered overhead, closer now, no longer just a speaker feed but live, shouting through a cracked bullhorn from the center platform. Final trial, red collar, Team 13. The crowd roared. I stepped forward. I could hear my own footsteps over the noise. That was the strange thing. I could hear the rubber soles slap against wet concrete. I could see every drop of water left clinging to the edges of the barricades. My vision narrowed. Not from fear, not from adrenaline. It was like my brain had started cutting out everything it didn't need. The noise became texture. The movement became patterns. I didn't feel ready, but I understood the shape of what was coming. The gate opened. 6 grinners. 2 ran. That detail mattered. Until now, most of them had staggered. Half limbs, broken balance, sluggish reaction times. These 2 were different. Their clothes weren't decayed. Their skin had color. One had both eyes. They ran at full sprint, one low to the ground like a linebacker, the other swerving between obstacles like she remembered how to cut corners. I didn't wait. I bolted to the left and vaulted over a broken metal drum, swung wide toward a collapsed bleacher panel, and circled back through the standing water. The others were slower, traditional infected, the kind you could avoid if you kept moving. But the runners, they were different. I needed space, not a kill. Anna had been right. They wanted time. I led the runners in a wide loop, ducking through cover, knocking over crates, using their momentum against them. I didn't swing the rebar. I didn't waste energy. I wasn't there to fight. I was there to last. Every second I moved was another second the crowd got what they wanted. Desperation, evasion, spectacle. But desperation makes mistakes. On the 4th pass, I misjudged a puddle, stepped wrong, slipped, and landed on my elbow. The pain flared sharp, but there was no time to register it. One of the runners shrieked, a high rasp that rattled in the concrete. He was already closing the gap, arms spread wide, teeth exposed. I reached for the rebar, too slow. His hand caught my arm. and I drove the sharpened end of the rod straight through the soft flesh above his knee. Not his chest, not his skull, the leg. He dropped. I rolled free. The second runner came from the side. I barely saw her, a blur of flailing limbs and snarling rot. I ducked, felt a hand graze the back of my head, and spun behind a concrete barrier. She slammed into it at full speed and staggered. I ran again. Another minute passed. Then another. I kept moving. Somewhere in the distance the announcer barked something unintelligible, and the crowd responded with a new chant, fast, sharp, rhythmic. I didn't stop to listen. The grinners were slowing. All but one. He was missing half his face and a chunk of shoulder, but he was gaining ground. His fingers dragged along the wall, blood streaking behind him. I led him toward the center of the pit. Then the sirens blared. The gate opened again. No, it wasn't over yet. They weren't done. A new shape emerged from the tunnel, taller, bulkier, wrapped in metal and rubber straps like a makeshift exosuit. Its skin was green-gray, thick with growths I didn't recognize. Its jaw was locked wide open, pinned with rusted nails through the cheeks, and its eyes were gone. They had blinded it, on purpose. Its chest heaved as it stepped fully into the arena, water lapping at its knees. The other grinners scattered, almost as if they sensed something they couldn't name. Even the fast one, the one who'd nearly had me against the barricade, pulled back and circled wide. This thing, this brute, moved slowly, but not without intent, not like the others. Every step it took landed with a deliberate rhythm, like it wasn't just walking. It was feeling, tracking, testing the floor. And every time its foot hit the concrete, I felt it in the soles of my feet, like a low thud inside my chest, like something massive shifting through the earth. There was a name shouted from the stands, repeated over and over until it drowned out the drums. Anchor, anchor, anchor. I didn't understand at first, not until I saw the chain. A rusted length of towing cable trailed from its back, bolted directly into the exposed spine, looped around its torso twice, dragging across the floor with a metallic hiss. At the far end of the line was a block of solid concrete, 1 meter cube painted red, pocked with impact dents. That was the anchor. They had tethered this creature to something it had learned to carry, something it used as a weapon. The anchor turned its head, sniffing the air. Its mouth remained wide, locked open in that horrible, unnatural gape. It couldn't see me, but it knew I was there. And with a sudden, violent jolt, it yanked the chain taut, lifted the concrete block off the ground, and began to swing it in a slow, deliberate arc. The crowd roared. I backed toward the barricade, eyes darting to the exits that didn't exist. The other infected, grinners, were no longer part of the show. They watched from the edges now, uncertain, cautious, maybe even afraid. This wasn't about infection anymore. It wasn't even about blood. It was theater, and the anchor was the final act. It took a step forward, dragging the block behind it. The motion was smooth, practiced. The cable hissed against the wet concrete, leaving a trail of iron filings and rust flakes in its wake. The anchor began to rotate, 1 foot, then the next, building momentum. I moved, hard left, behind the remaining stack of broken bleachers, vaulting over a ruined barricade and crouching low. I heard the chain whip past, less than a second after I moved, a blur of steel and concrete that struck the wall where I'd been. The entire corner of the arena shook. Chunks of stone and rebar exploded outward. I ran again, zigzagging toward the far end, trying to stay behind cover. The anchor turned to follow, slow but unrelenting. It didn't chase. It didn't sprint. It just advanced, dragging that weapon, sensing where I'd been and swinging the block in wide, punishing arcs that obliterated anything in its path. I caught a glimpse of a technician on the catwalk above, clipboard in hand, mouth covered by a respirator. He wasn't watching the fight. He was taking notes. This was a test, a calibration. They weren't just feeding the crowd. They were logging performance. I ducked behind another crate. The floor beneath me was slick with blood and oil, and the wood creaked under my weight. Across the arena, the anchor paused. Its head twitched to the left, then to the right. It sniffed again, the wide open maw sucking air like a broken vacuum. Its chest expanded, then it roared. No words, no tone, just noise, deep and mechanical, like an engine turning over in a ruined junkyard. It was a sound made by something that no longer understood what a voice was. Then it hurled the block. It let go of the chain completely. The concrete cube soared across the arena and shattered the crate behind me, with a sound like thunder cracking inside a tin drum. Shards of splintered wood and rusted bolts rained down. One caught me in the shoulder. Another scraped my ear. I hit the ground hard and rolled, scraping my palms bloody as I scrambled to my feet. I heard it move again, this time faster. With the chain gone, it was no longer bound to the act of dragging. The anchor charged. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I ran straight at it. The thing didn't expect that. Its gait stumbled for half a second, its knees locking as it braced to swing. But without the anchor block, it had no weapon in hand, just fists. I slid under its swing and jammed the rebar spear straight into its calf as I passed. The metal slid deep into rotted muscle and struck something solid. Bone, maybe. It didn't scream. It didn't even flinch. It turned. That's when I saw the back of its skull. Plates. Bolted steel across the occipital. They had armored it, reinforced the parts that would normally be its weakness. Whatever research team had made this thing, they'd accounted for decapitation, for trauma, for resistance. You couldn't kill the anchor like the others. But it bled. Thick, dark sludge oozed from the leg wound, trailing behind it as it stepped forward. I realized that was my only advantage. It could still bleed, and bleeding meant damage. If not now, then eventually. I ran again, faster now, heart hammering against my ribs, my breath catching in short, clipped pulls. The anchor followed. Its feet slammed into the ground like mallets. It moved with a purpose I'd never seen in an infected. No twitching, no jerks, just force. I caught a glimpse of Anna at the edge of the field, standing behind the gate with her fists clenched around the bars. She was shouting something. Her mouth moved in frantic shapes. I couldn't hear her. The crowd's roar was too loud. The floodlights shifted, angling down into the pit, casting long, warped shadows across the ground. The anchor's shape loomed like a moving sculpture, massive, twisted, broken. I ducked behind another steel panel and tried to catch my breath. My vision swam. The air burned in my lungs. My legs screamed for rest. And then I saw it. The chain, still attached to its back, just barely, looped once around a bracket embedded in the spine. The rest of the cable trailed freely across the floor. And in that moment, I remembered something Calvin had said once, before any of this. If you want to stop a machine, you jam the mechanism. You don't fight the whole system. You find the piece that keeps it moving and break that. I waited. Let it come to me. The anchor rounded the corner, dragging the last of the cable behind it. I sprinted past it in a wide arc, grabbed the end of the chain, and yanked with every ounce of force left in my arms. The chain caught, it twisted, the anchor stumbled, and I ran, still holding the chain, wrapping it around a standing support beam, then circling again, creating a loop, a tether, a snare. The anchor thrashed as the tension caught, its legs skidding across the concrete, its balance faltering. It roared again, louder this time, with a sound that cracked somewhere in the back of its throat like tearing metal. I didn't stop. 2 more passes. I tied off the last loop around a jagged piece of collapsed fencing, shoved a rusted crowbar through it, and drove it into the concrete with the flat end of my rebar rod. The anchor turned, took a step, and stopped. The chain had locked. It reared back, howled, fought against it, but it couldn't move forward. The noise from the crowd dimmed, confused, murmuring. They didn't expect this. I stepped into the center of the pit, covered in grime and blood and soaked sweat, and raised the broken spear still clutched in my hand. The anchor strained. I raised my voice, not to the crowd, Not to the Iron Lords, but to whatever was left of the world listening on the other side of all this. Not in words, just presence. Just the act of standing, battered but alive, under a sky lit by rusting floodlights and the eyes of strangers who had forgotten what it meant to survive without spectacle. The anchor writhed behind me, its movements laboured now, the heavy chain tangled around its limbs, every jerk against the tension pulling it closer to the concrete it once dragged so effortlessly. The lights didn't dim, the crowd didn't fall silent, but something in the air shifted. A tension snapped, the final thread of performance unravelled. The sirens didn't blare. No fireworks, no celebratory signal. Just a low mechanical groan as the heavy steel gates on the far side opened, not to reveal a new horror, but a path. The tunnel beyond was unlit and narrow, flanked by rusted fencing and razor wire. I waited for someone to shout, for the announcer's voice to echo down one more instruction, one last order. Nothing came. I didn't look back. Not at the thing I'd left snarling in the shadows. Not at the crowd, or the blood-soaked field that had almost become my grave. I crossed the threshold into the dark corridor alone, steps slow and uneven, each one testing the weight of my legs. My left thigh throbbed. A rib on the right side burned every time I took a breath. There was blood on my palms and down the back of my neck. Most of it not mine, but I didn't know for sure. I couldn't feel the difference anymore. The passage twisted for what felt like half a mile. I passed cameras mounted to broken brackets, half of them hanging loose, wires exposed. No guards, no weapons, just the sound of my boots dragging through the dust. Finally, a doorway opened into another locker room, larger than the one we'd been stuffed into, cleaner, with medical kits stacked against the walls, and a metal tub filled with lukewarm water. A woman sat on a folding chair near the door. No armor, no mask. Her clothes were clean, tan work shirt, cargo pants, laced boots that hadn't seen the field in months. She looked at me like a mechanic inspecting a damaged part. "You're done," she said, voice flat. I didn't answer. She nodded toward the water. "Wash, you've got 10 minutes. I dropped the broken spear. It hit the floor with a dull clang and rolled under a bench. My jacket came next, then the shirt, stiff with dried sweat and blood. The water stung as I lowered myself into it, but I didn't flinch. I let it soak into my skin, wash down my face, rinse the filth from my arms and under my nails. It wasn't comfort, it was utility. She handed me a towel. "Iron Lords will give you your payment once you're out. Crate of rations, fuel vouchers, clearance papers, usual stuff." Still, I said nothing. She shrugged like it didn't matter. "Your team gets to walk. No repeats. That's the rule." I wanted to ask about the others. Ray, who hadn't come back after night 1. Calvin, who had been buried without a word. Nolan, who hadn't spoken in weeks. But I didn't. I already knew the answer. The Colosseum had chewed through everything soft inside us, spat out what was left, and now handed it back wrapped in metal and stamped with permission to leave. They gave me a change of clothes, faded black cargo pants, a dark grey thermal, a canvas jacket with the Iron Lord's symbol sewn on the back. I tore the patch off before I even left the room. The exit led out behind the north side of the stadium. A gravel path curved toward the main road, now mostly reclaimed by weeds and broken signs. 3 guards stood near a flatbed truck. Anna and Nolan were already there, each holding a canvas duffel. When they saw me, Anna's shoulders dropped just slightly. Not relief exactly, but release. Nolan didn't move. He just stared at me like I was someone he hadn't expected to ever see again. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The guard handed me my pack. It was heavier than I expected. Inside was food, sealed water, antibiotics, a small canister of gasoline, and a paper map marked with clearance zones and fuel stations allegedly under Iron Lord protection. A temporary passport to whatever came next. The truck dropped us off 5 miles outside the city ruins, where the smoke was still rising from a recent caravan ambush. A burned-out bus lay half buried in the mud, frame twisted into skeletal loops, blackened bones still visible near the back wheels. A reminder. We set up camp behind the shell of an old gas station. I watched the sky turn from grey to violet as the wind pushed ash across the pavement. Anna cooked something over a small flame. Nolan sat with his arms around his knees, eyes closed, head down. I asked her quietly, "Did he ever talk?" She shook her head. "What happens now?" Anna stared into the fire. "We leave. We put the stadium behind us. We find a road that doesn't lead back to this." It sounded simple, but nothing was. That night, I didn't sleep. Again, I lay under the half-roof of the station, staring up through a hole in the metal at the stars, dim behind smoke, blurred by distance, but still burning. Somewhere out there, above all the noise and rot and screaming crowds, the world still turned. And I was still part of it. Barely. But I was. In the months that followed, we moved west, avoided the major roads, stayed clear of rail lines and refueling depots. Any place the Iron Lords had touched, we bypassed. Word of the Colosseum travelled faster than we did. Some said it had moved to another city, taken root in the ruins of a collapsed airport, built new walls and raised new lights. The trials, it seemed, had become a circuit. I heard stories of other survivors forced into the pit, of variations, traps, fire, blindfolded rounds. One team was reportedly given no weapons at all. They said the handlers stood just beyond the walls, laughing, placing bets on who would scream first. The game had shifted. What started as a performance for control, for fear, had evolved into something colder, more precise. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was research. Word came from a scavenger out of Salt Lake, quiet man, ex-medic from the National Guard, missing 2 fingers and part of his right ear. He said he'd found a manifest sealed in a wrecked FEMA transport, an internal document stamped with both Department of Defense and Iron Lord's insignia. Buried in the pages were references to behavioral viability events, numbered and tagged like clinical trials. Each arena, each trial, had been assigned codes. The Anchorage ruins, BV014. The Redline Stadium where I fought, BV021. The format was too formal to be made up, too exact. He'd memorized the codes before the pages burned. What stuck with me were the words under the section labeled primary targets. Subject focus: fear-induced neural regression under engineered threat parameters, high-stress engagement with modified Type C hosts, anchor class. Observe pattern failure, cognitive collapse, and variable moral thresholds. I didn't sleep that night either. A few days later, we passed through the outskirts of Grand Junction. The place had once been a haven, fortified rail yards, old National Guard outposts, solar farms converted into water catch systems. But now, the walls were covered in red spray paint. Not warnings, not resistance slogans, branding. Big block letters that read, "Watch the strongest survive Nightfall Trials Redline Station." Beneath it, a symbol I recognized, a half-gear, blood red, cleaved down the middle. They weren't hiding anymore. Anna and I argued about what to do next. She wanted to go south, toward Flagstaff, maybe even into the Arizona Deadlands, where few dared follow. I wanted to head north, up past Rifle, into the forests, away from the roads, the power lines, the rails. Nolan didn't vote. He hadn't spoken in weeks, but his eyes tracked everything, every conversation, every sound outside the tent. One night, I found him standing at the edge of our camp, watching the dark without moving. I didn't ask what he saw. In the end, we split. Anna said goodbye in her way. Short nod, hand on the shoulder, no promises. She took one of the rifles and half the meds. Nolan chose to stay with me. Maybe because I didn't ask anything from him. Maybe because I never forced him to talk. Or maybe he just knew I wasn't going anywhere that looked like an arena again. We traveled for 3 weeks through backcountry, eating freeze-dried rations and boiled roots, avoiding anyone with visible tattoos, uniforms, or new boots. The Iron Lords had a way of branding their people, not with ink, but with polish. They were clean. Their gear matched. Their vehicles had too much power, too much fuel. You could hear them before you saw them, and you always moved before they arrived. It was in an abandoned firewatch tower near Route National Forest that I found the tape, an old microcassette, wound tight, labeled with a faded sticker that had once said C9 Conf Notes. Next to it was a recorder, water-damaged but functional. I cleaned the heads with cotton and spit, replaced the batteries, pressed play. The voice on the tape was low, professional, male, East Coast accent, maybe DC or Philly. Log 6, segment Echo 9, subject anchor variant, Site Bravo. Behavior remains partially predictable under induced starvation. Subject has ceased vocalization. Reactivity to pain negligible. Audio lure triggers remain effective. Escape risk, low. Note, spinal modifications holding under repeated trauma. Neural sheath decay stabilized with compound 3-5. Noticing residual motor control in prefrontal mapping. Suggest continued testing in live field conditions. Recommend behavioral escalation through false loss scenarios. He paused. Something clicked in the background. Metal. Then the voice continued. Also, subject recognizes music. The tape ended there. I played it twice. Then again. By the fourth time, I noticed something faint in the background of the recording, layered under the words. A faint hum. Not electricity, not a motor, a tune, whistled, off-key, something that sounded like an old lullaby. I smashed the recorder. After that, we didn't stop moving for days. I knew what it meant. The anchor was never wild. It had been designed, fed, observed. Everything it had done in that pit, every gesture, every roar, was part of a controlled experiment. We weren't just survivors thrown into chaos. We were variables. We were test groups. The anchor wasn't unique. It was a prototype. That changed everything. It meant the Iron Lords weren't opportunists riding out the collapse. They were part of its shape. They weren't surviving the virus. They were using it, repurposing it, understanding it in ways that regular survivors like us could never begin to grasp. And the trials, they were the crucible for their findings. Real-world laboratories wrapped in blood and fire and the roar of desperate crowds. Nolan and I reached a checkpoint outside Meeker, where a rusted sign still bore the remnants of a US Forest Service emblem. The outpost had been abandoned for years, but the solar cells still functioned. We charged our radios, scavenged a few map chips, and sat under the broken awning, watching the sky turn that strange reddish-violet haze that always came before storms. The kind of color that didn't exist in the world before the virus. Back then, sunsets had gradients, blue to orange to soft pink. Now they looked like something torn out of a wound. We spent the night in the ranger's loft, half collapsed, windows shattered, insulation sagging from the ceiling. Nolan fell asleep sitting upright, wrapped in a blanket stitched together from bits of old uniforms. I lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the tin roof, watching shadows shift between the trees. I didn't expect visitors. People didn't wander anymore unless they had reason. And those who did, well, you either smelled them, heard them, or buried them. But just before dawn, I spotted movement down the trail. A limping figure, tall and rail-thin, wrapped in canvas and leather, with a makeshift pack made from an old guitar case. I aimed my rifle before he even cleared the brush. He didn't flinch, just stopped at the edge of the clearing, hands visible, empty, and said in a voice like gravel soaked in whiskey, "I've got nothing worth stealing, just looking for a roof." I let him approach. He looked about 50, maybe older, though the lines on his face could have come from years in the dust instead of decades. His left eye was clouded over, milky white, with a scar that ran from brow to cheek like a lightning bolt. He introduced himself as Jonah. No last name. Didn't offer one, didn't ask for ours. He had the look of someone who'd been through more than he could explain. And yet, After a few sips from our water canteen and a bite of rationed trail bread, he started talking. Slowly, carefully, like each sentence was a weight he'd been carrying too long. Said he came from the east. Not just the ruins, but beyond. The places where the cities had been buried in chemical fires, where the ground still glowed at night if you walked barefoot long enough. He talked about a station outside of Knoxville, one of the first to fall, and then about something called the Nightfall Trials. That got my attention. He described a facility built into a collapsed mall, repurposed into a grid of narrow, dark hallways, lined with polished mirrors and walls that shifted under pressure. No spectators, no crowds. Just cameras, mounted high and quiet, their red lights never blinking. The trials weren't for sport, they were for silence. Observational study only. They released different types of infected, each labeled with cold precision. Type A for roamers, Type B for sprinters, Type C for anchor variants, and a new one, Type D. He didn't explain what Type D meant, only that they didn't make noise. They didn't move until you were very, very close, and they always knew your name. Jonah had been one of 9 survivors selected for Trial 7. He was the only one who made it out. Said he watched a woman he'd traveled with for 3 years get dismembered by something that didn't even touch her. When he found her body, it was clean. No marks. But her heart was gone, ripped straight through the back without breaking the skin. He paused there, looked down at his hands, said he hadn't spoken out loud in 6 months until he saw our campfire smoke, that he'd planned to walk into the canyon near Rangeley and never climb out. I believed him. And then he said something I still think about. It's not the infected that scare me anymore. It's the ones still doing paperwork, the ones behind the glass. I asked him what he meant, and he just tapped the side of his head. They've been building patterns, running simulations. The trials are real, but they're just the harvest. Everything else, the broadcasts, the false safe zones, even the road markers, they're all pieces of the same signal. I didn't understand at first, not completely, but I remembered the tape I'd found, the word mapping, and that hum under the doctor's voice, that eerie broken lullaby. Jonah stayed with us 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, he left before sunrise, left us the rest of his supplies, some dried berries, a hand-drawn map of the canyon systems, and a shortwave receiver with a cracked screen and barely enough battery to catch a few channels. I tuned it out of habit later that evening. Static mostly, then a burst of tone, then a voice I hadn't heard since Redline. Confirmed participant exit from BVE 021. Neural degradation within acceptable thresholds. Commence secondary observation. Flag subject for resilience tier. I turned the device off and tossed it into the river. But it was too late. The voice didn't need the radio anymore. It was in my memory now. Branded, etched. Nolan didn't ask why I broke it. He just watched the water carry it away. We left the next day, traveled west towards Steamboat Springs, hoping to find shelter among the ski lodges and abandoned resorts now buried in ash and time. Along the way, we passed roads with markers that hadn't been there weeks ago, new signs with white symbols painted over green ones, directing registered survivors towards something called renewal stations. I didn't trust them, but people were following them. We saw one group in the distance, 10 or 12 in uniform formation, all wearing identical scarves around their necks, each carrying a stamped supply bag. They didn't wave, they didn't blink, they moved like machines. Jonah had been right. It took me a few minutes to realize what I was looking at. Not scavengers, not a convoy, something more deliberate. They weren't protecting themselves from the infected. They were part of a program, a system. Their pace was measured, their spacing exact. And in the silence between steps, you could almost hear it. The rhythm of something being recorded, catalogued, timed. I didn't know what resilience tier meant back when I heard it crackle through the shortwave. But I understand it now. It was a classification, not just for survivors, but for what we could endure. A way of tagging people like me, those who made it through the trials but didn't break, not fully. We had become metrics, living files, and like any valuable asset, we were being watched. That night, I found a ridge above the highway. No signs of infected, just the dark sweep of pine and the echo of cold air against broken trees. I sat beside Nolan, the fire burning low between us, and asked him finally what he remembered from Kansas City, from before the silence, from the moment the light went out behind his eyes and the noise took its place. He didn't answer. Not at first, but after a while his voice came out quiet, strained, like a rusted hinge turned too far. They took my sister into one of the red buses, said she was cleared for higher potential. I tried to follow, got beat down by a guy wearing a FEMA patch and a smile like he knew I'd scream before I hit the ground. He turned toward the fire. I never saw her again. We didn't speak after that. There wasn't anything to add. The next day, I found a marker carved into the bark of a lodgepole pine. Fresh, clean lines, a gear split in half. The Iron Lords had been through here recently, or maybe the people who came after them. Either way, they were moving faster now, leaving less behind. 2 days west of Steamboat, we found what used to be a communications substation buried in the hills. The satellite dish was intact. The power array had been stripped down, but the backup battery core still flickered with a trickle of life. Inside, behind locked doors and the stink of old rodents, we found a single screen still glowing blue. No signal, just code. But the machine wasn't empty. A live audio loop played every 30 seconds. It was my voice. Trial 4, Red Collar, Team 13. Subject persisted under Anchor class aggression. No observed psychological fracture. Recommend retention. I stood frozen. Nolan stared at the terminal, then at me. No questions. He didn't need to ask. I could see it written in the way he sat, tense but accepting. He'd known for longer than I had. We'd never escaped. Not really. Even when we walked out of the Colosseum, the doors had never closed behind us. The trial had just changed shape. The pit had no walls now, just miles, and watchers. That night, I made a decision. I told Nolan to keep heading west, to cross into Utah if he could, follow the old aquifer routes toward the salt flats, find what few survivors still refused to plug back into the system. I gave him half the supplies and the map Jonah had left behind. "I'm not going with you," I said. He didn't argue. He just looked at me, quiet and understanding, like he'd already guessed. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before I turned back toward the facility. The screen was still glowing. I connected the dish manually, rerouted the remaining power, and amplified the outgoing loop using one of the buried fiber lines still wired to the tower's base. I wanted them to hear me. I wanted whoever had watched us bleed in that stadium, who recorded our movements and labeled our screams with performance metrics. I wanted them to know I understood now. I stood in front of the camera mounted to the corner of the room, blinking red, barely visible, and I spoke clearly, slowly, into the lens. "You made me, and you marked me, but I am not yours." Then I smashed the terminal with the heel of my boot, crushed the battery with the edge of a fire axe, and poured the rest of the fuel over the console. The fire caught fast. I watched it burn for as long as I could stand the heat, and then I left. I don't know where I'm going. Not exactly. Maybe toward the mountain caves I read about in a journal left behind by a dead geologist near Glenwood Springs. Maybe toward nothing at all. But I keep walking, because there's still something moving behind me in the dark. Not grinners, not sprinters or shamblers or whatever twisted form they've conjured next. Something bigger. I hear the chain sometimes, dragging faintly across the ground, even when I'm alone. I see shapes in the distance that don't sway like trees or shift like animals. I don't run. I walk into it, because I need to know how far they're willing to follow the thing they created, and how much of me is still mine. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, Not even the silence.